A food delivery company just trained a 1.6 trillion parameter frontier model without a single Nvidia GPU. Sit with how strange that sentence is, because the headlines are running with the wrong half of it. The company is Meituan. In China, they move lunch. This week, they open-sourced LongCat 2.0, a model that had quietly been sitting near the top of OpenRouter's usage charts under a codename Owl Alpha, before anyone knew whose it was. People were already routing real production traffic through it. They just didn't know they were talking to a delivery app. I've watched a lot of Chinese model launches get oversold, so my default here is suspicion. But this one is interesting for a reason most coverage is fumbling. The story is not the benchmark chart, it's the hardware underneath it. So let me separate the marketing from the part that should genuinely make American chip strategy nervous. Here's the claim that matters. Meituan says LongCat 2.0 completed both pre-training and inference entirely on domestic Chinese chips. Not Nvidia, not smuggled H100s. Roughly 50,000 domestic accelerators, Chinese-designed silicon, doing the full job. They're calling it the first trillion parameter model to finish the whole training run on alternative hardware. Why does that carry weight when a benchmark score wouldn't? Because we've seen the benchmark trick before. Chinese labs like DeepSeek have posted strong numbers for a while, but there was always an asterisk. The heavy lifting, pre-training, the part that eats tens of thousands of GPUs for months, still leaned on foreign silicon. Inference on domestic chips is the easy half. Inference is a sprint. You run the finished model and serve tokens. The hardware just has to be good enough. Pre-training is the marathon. It demands enormous memory bandwidth, brutal chip-to-chip interconnect, and software that doesn't fall over when one card and 50,000 hiccups at hour 600. That's where domestic alternatives have historically choked. So if the full process claim holds, the line has moved. It's no longer good enough to run models. It's good enough to build them. Let me make the marathon concrete. A run at this scale is 50,000 chips that all have to agree, constantly at high speed for weeks. The bottleneck usually isn't the math on any single chip. It's the plumbing between them. Gradients get shuffled across the whole cluster every step, so interconnect bandwidth and communication software matter as much as raw compute. One flaky link at hour 400 and a run that cost a fortune corrupts or stalls. Nvidia's real moat was never just the chip. It was the interconnect and the mature software that keeps a run like this from eating itself. So the impressive part isn't that the chips can multiply, it's that the surrounding system held together to the finish line. That's the piece I want independently confirmed, and the piece that's hard to fake at scale. But my skeptic's hat, because you came for engineering, not cheerleading. Trained entirely on Chinese chips is doing a lot of quiet work. The compute die can be domestic, while the high bandwidth memory stacked next to it is not. That memory is its own choke point, dominated by a few foreign suppliers, and nobody's published a clean bill of materials for this cluster. The design tools, the fabrication process, those are separate links, and domestic can quietly mean domestic for the part we're pointing at. A press release is not an audit. Until an outside team confirms the training logs and hardware inventory, treat the specifics as a claim, not a fact. That said, let me steelman it, because the architecture is where LongCat gets genuinely clever. And cleverness in architecture is exactly how you survive on weaker chips. LongCat 2.0 is a sparse mixture of experts. 1.6 trillion parameters total, but only around 48 billion active per token. Enormous in what it knows, small in what it runs per token. If you're stuck with chips that have less horsepower than the latest Nvidia part, this is precisely the design you reach for. You stop paying for the whole brain on every word, you pay for the slice you need. Sparsity here isn't a gimmick, it's a hardware coping strategy, and it's the right one. They pushed it further with two tricks. Zero computation experts. For easy tokens, the network routes to an expert that essentially does nothing and skips the work. And token-level dynamic compute, deciding per token how much of the model to wake up. Together, you get a 1.6 trillion parameter model behaving, cost-wise, like a mid-sized one. When silicon is the constraint, you don't out-muscle the problem, you out-engineer it. One more choice I respect. Instead of training one giant generalist, they train 3 specialists, an agent expert, a reasoning expert, an interaction expert, then fuse them into one student through multi-teacher distillation. Broad competence without a single monolithic run that has to nail everything at once, and conveniently easier to schedule across an imperfect cluster. So does it perform? On agentic coding, yes. On SWE Bench Pro, it posts a 59.5, edging out the reported number for GPT 5.5 and near Gemini 3.1 Pro and Claude Opus 4.6. On Terminal Bench, around 70. On agentic web search, high 70s. A top-tier open weight showing on the workloads that matter for software agents. But here's the break. Being near the top of OpenRouter by usage is not the same as being near the top by quality. 10 trillion tokens a month sounds like a market verdict. It's a verdict about price. When a capable model shows up cheap, traffic floods in because most agentic workload is price-sensitive grunt work. Volume tells you it's good enough and cheap. It doesn't tell you it's the best. And a published benchmark is a starting point for your own testing, not a substitute. Open weights help because you can download it and check. So check, don't trust. 2 things that change who this is for: the license, permissive, MIT style, weights on GitHub and Hugging Face. Do what you want, including commercially. No per token bill, no vendor holding the off switch. And the context window, a native 1 million token window, reached through a custom linear complexity attention scheme. Standard attention scales with the square of sequence length, which is why long context is slow and expensive. Make it closer to linear, and 1 million tokens stops being a stunt and starts being usable for feeding an entire codebase in at once. Now the part that should make Washington put down its coffee. The whole theory of chip export controls was a timing bet. Choke off the best silicon and use slow China. Buy years, keep the frontier a generation ahead. That bet depended on one assumption, that you cannot train frontier-scale models on second-best hardware. LongCat 2.0 is a direct, public attack on that assumption. Even if the fully domestic claim is 80% true instead of 100, the direction is unmistakable. The workaround is maturing from runs models to trains models. A moat that leaks isn't a moat. It's a speed bump with good marketing. Let me be fair. One model is not a trend, and this could be a subsidized showcase run, hard to repeat cheaply. The domestic chips may still be pricier or less reliable per useful operation, and a delivery giant can eat the cost of a prestige run in a way a pure AI lab can't. So some of that pricing is strategy, not economics. I'm not calling the race over. I'm calling the assumption behind the strategy into question. So, my verdict: strip away the nationalism, and what's left is a serious piece of systems engineering. The benchmarks are good, but not the headline. The headline is that a team, boxed in by hardware constraints, answered with sparsity, dynamic compute, and smart distillation instead of throwing more silicon at the wall, and got a near-frontier agentic coder out the other end. Apparently, without the chips everyone assumed were mandatory. If that hardware claim survives scrutiny, the export control moat is thinner than its architects admit. If it doesn't, we still learn that clever architecture buys a shocking amount of runway on weak chips. Either way, the lesson is the oldest one in the book. Constraints don't kill good engineering. They produce it. If this was useful, subscribe. This channel is where I read the spec sheet so you don't have to take the press release at face value. See you in the next one.